We'll start reading this morning in chapter 12, verse 13 through 17. And then they sent some of the Pharisees and Herodians to him in order to trap him in a statement. They came and said to him, "Teacher, we know that you are truthful and defer to no one. For you are not partial to any, but teach the way of God in truth. Is it lawful to pay a poll tax to Caesar or not? Shall we pay or shall we not pay?" But he, knowing their hypocrisy, said to them, "Why are you testing me? Bring me a denarius to look at." And they brought one, and he said to them, "Whose likeness and inscription is this?" And they said to him, "Caesar's." And Jesus said to them, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And they were amazed at him. This is a very brief and simple passage, but one that is often fought against and resisted in regards to the church. And it deals with an issue that most of us don't care to deal with or talk about, and it's a reality of life. Just thinking on, if we serve a God who is omnipotent, but we don't believe that he is sovereign, then what happens is in our life, we live as though somehow we can manipulate his power and we wield his power. But if we worship a God who is omnipotent and sovereign, and we know that he is, then what's our only option? Our only option is to surrender. And that is where we all need to be living. And especially in light of this passage, dealing with what it deals with, we need to surrender to God on all aspects of life and all that he calls us to and admonishes in. And so I introduce you this morning, this one conscience-stricken taxpayer wrote the IRS and he said, "Dear sir, my conscience bothered me. Here's the $175 which I own back taxes." And then came the PS. "If my conscience still bothers me, I'll send you the rest." This is a particular issue that none of us really care to think about, talk about. Oftentimes, especially out here in Battleground, we have the levy, and it's presented to us as though we have some say in the levy. And yet, when we vote against the levy, they just keep pressing till they finally get their way. They're going to get their money from us and all of these things. And we fight and resist the government and all the things that come with it. And we look at it as this great big evil. But the reality of it is the government is not evil in and of itself, in the sense that it is a part of God's, what we refer to theologically as God's common grace. It is that aspect within society that keeps us from becoming as bad as we can possibly be. You see, if there was anarchy, yes, and there was no law enforcement, and there was no government, and there was no restraint, and we were left to ourselves, imagine where we would be. I mean, look at the Old Testament. When everyone and the judges, when everyone did what was right in their own eyes, right? Imagine if we had no restraint at all. So the reality is the government is a part of God's common grace to all of mankind. And Richard Halverson, who was once chaplain of the United States Senate, realized this fact. And I give you this quote from him. He said, "To be sure, men will abuse and misuse the institution of the state, just as men, because of sin, have abused and misused every other institution in history, including the Church of Jesus Christ. But this does not mean that the institution is bad or that it should be forsaken." He went on to say, "It simply means that men are sinners and rebels in God's world, and this is the way they behave with good institutions. As a matter of fact, it is because of this very sin that there must be a human government in order to maintain in history until the final ultimate rule of Jesus Christ is established. Human government is better than anarchy, and the Christian must recognize the divine right of the state." When we look at Romans chapter 13, Paul affirms for us that all authority is God-delegated authority. No kingdom exists without God. It does not rise or fall upon its own. It is by the sovereign hand and will of God that they are what they are. And so therefore we have to recognize this fact. And Jesus, in instructing the disciples in response to these religious leaders, he brings this point to us. And again, we find Jesus interacting with the Sanhedrin. And I titled this, undertitle it, "The Christian's Duties." And You might even title it the Christian's allegiances, and we often don't like to use that term in regards to government, but at the same time we need to understand that that is a part of God's design, and we need to see it as such. And Jesus helps us to see that, but He renders for us an understanding that there is a greater issue at hand, and that is our relationship to God. Beginning with this story, each of the various groups that made up the Sanhedrin are going to put Jesus to the test. We saw them in chapter 11, verse 27. They came to him in the temple in Jerusalem, and they began to challenge him about his authority, which led to him giving this parable in chapter 12, verses 1 through 12. And then now is going to come a series of tests. And they're going to come and they're going to question him. And obviously they're trying to ensnare him and entrap him. And Mark gives us this indication in chapter 12, verse 13, as their purpose for why they come to Jesus. But first we have the Pharisees on the question of taxes. We have the Sadducees who come with the question of the resurrection. And so I almost subtitled this, live, right, work, pay taxes, and die. But that's a little too harsh because we're also talking about the resurrection. So I sort of scrapped that subtitle and I just left it with what I have. And then the final section is the scribes on the question of spiritual interpretation. And this is very fascinating because notice with me in chapter 12, verse 24, as he is dealing with the issue of these religious leaders, he says to them in verse 24, "Is it not the reason you are mistaken that you do not understand the scriptures or the power of God?" I could say that probably for a lot of areas and dimensions of our life. We do not understand the scriptures, nor do we understand the power of God. And so therefore, our misconceptions and our lack of understanding in life. Each story, Jesus is going to be addressed as the teacher. And in each of these, Jesus is going to demonstrate his authority, his exousia, and goes all the way back to chapter 1 and his baptism when the Holy Spirit came into him. And from that point on, he was manifesting an authority that was like no other authority that anyone had ever seen, especially in regards to religious leaders. He was speaking in and of his own innate authority and power to do so, where the religious leaders were speaking on the interpretation of so-and-so or the teaching of so-and-so. But Jesus was speaking out of his own exousia, his own authority, and he had carried on his ministry in that same power. And in chapter 12, verses 13 through 17, really the first few verses are only to set up the declaration and the statement in verse 17, that authoritative word that comes from Jesus, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." So again, all the way through this, we are finding the authority of Jesus. And again, this is the authority of Jesus. Okay? It's not my view on government or whether I should or should not pay taxes. This is not Steve's view. This has nothing to do with my politic. It has everything to do with what Christ said and what he expects of us as believers, right? So we understand that going into this, right? And I try to keep my politics out of everything that I minister from the pulpit because it's about his word, not my own. So the question of the Pharisees and the Herodians come in chapter 12, verses 13 through 14. And the questioners and their purpose come in chapter 12, verse 13. But if you'll notice with me that most translations begin this verse with a later in the NIV or a then. And these are temporal words. This is good stuff. These are temporal words. But the reality is, in the original, in the Greek text, these words aren't there. And essentially, Mark begins with what he always begins with, oftentimes in these episodes, is he begins what we call a historical present. He moves then right from one episode into the next. There is no temporal lapse or anything like that. There isn't a later, there isn't a then. In other words, this just follows on the heels, and there's going to be a series of these encounters. In other words, their press on Jesus and their persistent challenge toward Jesus is going to continue throughout this passage into the end of chapter 12. Finally, it's going to reach its climax in chapter 14. But Mark wants us to see that Jesus is going to face a barrage of challenges by these religious leaders. They are going to be relentless in this. They're going to be persistent in this. They are trying to ensnare him. They're trying to discredit him so that the people will stop listening to him and that ultimately they will be able to put him to death, because they do not care for the impact that he is having and the things that he is saying. And we will find that even by Jesus' statement, he is not trying to be a rebel for rebels' cause. But at the same time, whenever you speak truth and live the truth, you're going to bring about conflict. It's just inevitable. It's inevitable. Whenever man is face to face with the truth, man is going to, his first initial response in his sinful nature is resist that and reject that. It's amazing that even these religious leaders, when they come to Jesus and they're going to flatter him, they're going to say things that are absolutely true about Jesus Christ. But at the same time, although they are honoring and they're giving these statements of truth about him, at the same time, they are completely rejecting the very things that are coming out of their mouth, and they're rejecting him. It's amazing how blind we can be because of sin, but also because of our own willfulness and rebellion against God. And that is why ultimately we're held culpable. Yes? We have this reference then to they sent some of the Pharisees and Herodians to him in order to trap him in a statement. The they goes back to the Sanhedrin, goes back to chapter 11, verse 27. It goes back to the conflict that started with the challenge of his authority. They're going to persist, even though Jesus told the parable about the vineyard and he warned them about their coming judgment and their rejection of him. At the same time, they did not listen. They weren't going to heed the truth. They weren't going to change their unreceptiveness. They were even more persistent in putting him to death, and you can hear the wheels turning. And they think at this particular point they've got him. They have figured in their minds and their reasoning that they have the one dilemma that's going to hang him up and going to mess him up. And Jesus is going to evade him once again, and not in a sort of slight way in which he does not deal with the issue. He is going to deal with it face on, but he's going to take them farther than they want to go. And at the end of verse 17, the response from the people is they were amazed at him. They were amazed. Again, his authority, he speaks, and the people are astounded. So they continued their campaign against Jesus by sending some of the Pharisees and some of the Herodians. And it's very interesting that we have these two groups mentioned side by side. The first time that we hear these two groups in Mark's Gospel is back in chapter 3, verse 6. And they want to have Jesus put away. They want to be rid of him. They want him off the face of the earth. Already and early on in his ministry, they were already opposed to what was happening in a very aggressive way. Things are starting to come to a head. But it's fascinating. These two groups are side by side. And we could read past this and not pay any attention to it. But we're talking about enemies here who are now aligned against Jesus Christ. It's that bad for them. I mean, it's interesting because we can think about things that can unite people. Love is one of those things that should be that which unites us as the body of Christ. Right? Jesus says that they should know you by your love for one another, that you are mine and that we love each other. And in 1 John, John takes us again and challenges us that we are to love the brethren. If we really have fellowship with God, we will love one another. And love is a very binding element. We find a binding element here, and it is hatred. Hatred, as fragmenting, as destructive as it can be, it is going to be that thing that unites these two groups against Jesus Christ. And they are totally opposite from each other. Just some comparisons from their history. Pharisees, they were nationalistic. The Herodians, they sold themselves to the Romans. They aligned themselves with Herod, and this is why they're called the Herodians. They were completely political. The Pharisees were spiritual. The Pharisees represented the narrow conservative Judaism. The Herodians, the liberal syncretistic in their own convictions. It was about politics. It wasn't about the law necessarily for them, nor about the truth. It was about who was ruling as far as government went. We could say the Pharisees then were right-wingers and the Herodians were left-wingers. But here they're going to find the middle aisle. And that thing that's going to bind them is the hatred that they have for Jesus Christ. Represented resistance towards Rome, the Pharisees did, and the Herodians, they were accommodationists. You could not find two polar opposites joined together in their allegiance against Christ, and they were cemented in their common hatred for Jesus. The Pharisees hated him because he was disrupting the religious agenda. He was influencing the people and he was drawing them away. He spoke truth and they knew it, and they understood the power of the words that were coming from his mouth. Even though they did not necessarily see him as the Son of God just yet, but they understood that at least he was a prophet, a spokesman from God, and he was disrupting the agenda that they had for the people. The Herodians, they hated him because he threatened their political arrangement. You see, Paul affirms this fact in Acts, that the things that happened during the times of Christ didn't happen in some random quarter off in the middle of nowhere when no one knew what was happening. What Jesus did was impacting the entire Roman Empire. His word and his name was spreading throughout all of the regions. Everyone was hearing about it, even to the point in which the political leaders were seeking Jesus in their presence. There could be no worse alignment than these two, and it's very interesting, the very question they come and ask him, they figure that they have him trapped by this, and we'll get to that in a moment, but they were sent with a specific purpose. We have the word apostle. Apostolos comes from this particular term. This is the verbal form, apostolane. They were sent with a purpose, and the purpose is given in Mark chapter 13, or chapter 12, verse 13, in order to trap him in a statement. In other words, their motivation was bad, not positive. They weren't coming really looking for answers. They were trying to entrap him or ensnare him or catch him. And this particular Greek term is used of catching an animal in a snare or hooking a fish. In other words, you have to set the bait first. And that is exactly what they do in verse 14. They're going to flatter him. They're going to set the bait. They're figuring that they have him trapped. He's going to fall into their snare. They've got him. And all of a sudden now, what they want to accomplish is going to be accomplished. Not only that, but this particular term that's used in the realm of mankind, it implies deceit and treachery. So Mark already highlights their character before we even get into the questioning. And Jesus, notice verse 15, but he, knowing their hypocrisy, said to them, right? Jesus saw them for what they were. Mark wants us to see them for who they are before he presents the question that they bring to Jesus Christ. And they're going to propose this question in chapter 12, verse 14. And we see their insincerity in it and the fact that they bring along this flattery. And they think that they're going to use this to ensnare Christ. And they're going to flatter him first, and then they're going to present the question. Notice verse 14. They came and said to him, Teacher, we know that you are truthful, and you defer to no one. For you are not partial to any, but teach the way of God in truth. Is it lawful to pay a poll tax to Caesar or not? Shall we pay or shall we not pay? You see, they're thinking we got him, right? We've got him. You just learn this over time in life, right? You know when someone's really coming to you and asking you a question and they really want to learn. Especially in ministry, I learned over the years, the more that you serve the Lord, the more that you serve, the more you begin to read people. And you can read and understand the questioning. And you can tell when someone's coming with an honest question and they want to learn from you, or someone who's coming and they just want to entrap you. Right? I used to have a theology professor, and he used to refer to a bowling analogy, the sleeper pin, right? It's like they ask you a question, it's that front pin, then you knock it down and there's another one right behind it, see? They're trying to lure you in, and sometimes they'll come and they'll flatter you first, right? They want to pump you up and build you up and set you up for a fall. I had one brother did that to me one time, and it was, you know, you just see through it, but he came to me and he came with his flattery, and then came the question, and I said, you know, I know that you're really not honestly asking me that. So they come to Jesus and they're going to flatter him. And all the things that they say are true, but their motive is completely wrong. They're willing to concede these virtues to Jesus, even though they may not necessarily believe them, but they're going to use them in order to help him to relax, to loosen up his guard, to set him off a little bit, to put him back on his heels, so that way they can really then come in with the snare and they can really get him when they lay on the question to him. But the statements that come are pretty powerful. You are truthful, they say. It is not concerned to you about anyone, for you are not partial to any. And this is true of Jesus Christ. And literally it says this, for not, this is the negative particle, for not seeing the faces of men. In other words, you're not looking for man's favor. This is great. This is great because, listen to me, you can be compassionate and love people and still not be a people pleaser. See, I've said that before. I love you all, but I don't care if you like me or not. You see, it's not your favor that I'm after. And so therefore, when you preach the word, you're preaching not seeking the favor of men and to curry their favor and their glory. You're seeking the glory of who? God. They go on to say, but you teach the way of God and truth. And so all of these virtues that they lay at Jesus' feet. He is a man of integrity who is not swayed by men because he does not seek their favor. He teaches the way of God literally based upon the truth. But the reality of it is because Jesus is of this kind of character, he's not swayed by men. He's not a seeker of their favor. He will not be influenced by their flattery. So as they say these things that are true, they may not believe them, but at the same time, if he is of this character, he's not going to buy into what they're saying. And we find in verse 15 that he does not. But he, knowing their hypocrisy, said to them, "Why are you testing me? You see, I see you for who you are." The inquiry comes in at the end of verse 14, and the Greek word translated here, poll tax, it is kaisos, and this is where we get the word census from. It's reference to the annual poll tax or the head tax that was imposed on all residents of Judea and Samaria, Idumea and Samaria. And this is interesting because it was instituted in AD 6. And it's interesting because this tax was paid simply by the simple fact that you exist. If you're a Roman citizen in the regions in which this tax was required, you paid it simply just because you exist, and you were paying homage to Caesar. At the time of Archelaus, who was the ethnarch of that part of Palestine, he was deposed by Rome, and they annexed, this is an imperial province, and they laid upon this province a tax. Now the other areas, they allowed them to tax as they saw fit, but in this particular region, they set a legate who was overseeing this particular area, and they instituted this tax. And the amount of the tax was a denarius. But it was opposed from the very beginning, and we have an account of this in Acts chapter 5, verse 37, and Josephus goes on to tell even more detail what took place. But Judas the Galilean was opposed to this. He led this failed revolt in regards to it and ended up dying. In Jesus' day, they did not accept this and look upon this tax as favorable. And it wasn't the amount that was a problem for them. Most of us as Americans, when we fight against taxation, it's usually the amount, right? I only make so much money. I've got bills to pay. I have got a family to feed. I've got all of these things to take care of. And you're reaching into my pockets and taking this money away from me. And the amount that you take from me, you see. But see, for them, it was a different issue. For them, it wasn't about the amount. It was about the foreign domination as a Jew. You see, they were under the boot heels of the Roman Empire. They wanted to be subservient to their own king, be their own nation once again like they were in the days of the Old Testament. This was just another reminder of the fact that they were not so. And it was a reminder of the fact that they were in subjection to this domination from foreign nations. And also, it was the image that was on the coin. For them, it was blasphemous. And so therefore, how can we have any part in this? And so for them, it was not the amount, it was the issue at hand of what it represented to them as a Jewish people. And the Pharisees and the Herodians were exactly that. See, this is part of the problem. Sometimes we read our Americanness into the Bible instead of trying to understand it from their perspective and what it was like for them, you see. With this inquiry, they were hoping to impale Jesus on the horns of dilemma without a doubt. Obviously, in this question, they designed to place Jesus in a religious and political dilemma. You see, if Jesus had advised payment of this tax, then it would antagonize the people and they would turn against him and they would cease to look upon him as a spokesman for God. But if he had advised against payment, then hey, we can call in the Romans and they're going to retaliate because he is being a traitor, essentially. And so they figure, here, we have them ultimately. And you think about the two groups, the Pharisees and the Herodians, one spiritual, one political. The question they have devised that they're going to come with, they think that they have him. We've got him right here. And Jesus is just going to pull the rug right out from under him. And in the end of verse 17, he's going to leave everybody amazed, even those who came to challenge him. That's the authority that he wields and the understanding that he has. The response then comes from Jesus. First, he acknowledges the fact that he knows, verse 15, that they are playing the role of the hypocrite. They're wearing a mask. You see, what you're presenting to me is a facade, and I see through that. I know you for who you are, and why are you testing me? And he understood their nefarious intent, and then he's going to request a denarius, and he is going to ask them this question, whose portrait is this? Now it's interesting, verse 16, they brought one. So he asks for a denarius, verse 15, they brought one, would seem to indicate it was the Pharisees and the Herodians who presented the denarius for him to use for the object lesson. Intriguing. Think about that one for a little bit. So here they come to Christ. Here he responds, and he is going to draw upon the image that is on this coin, the portrait, the icon. This is interesting because this is where we get our English word icon from. But don't read too much into it, because actually the same word is used in Colossians in reference to Christ. He is the icon tu teu tu aratu. He is the image of the God, the invisible one. Okay? But it is the image or the likeness. This was objectionable to the Jews because it was looked upon as being an idol. It was blasphemous for them. This was a semi-divine bust of Tiberius on this particular coin, and it had the abbreviated Latin inscription, Tiberius Caesar, son of divine Augustus, or son of God. On the back, there was the equally offensive inscription that came, Pontificus Maximus, chief priest, and it was the picture of Livia, Tiberius' mother, who was on the back, and this is steeped in the emperor worship and the cult of emperor worship, that they looked upon him as being divine. This was what was offensive to them. You see, our reasons for not paying taxes aren't as zealous as theirs. They're really not, right? At least they can come up and muster up some spiritual reasons why not. Ours isn't because of whose face is on the coin or the dollar. Ours is because we feel like our pockets are being pilfered, right? But nonetheless, they're erroneous in this. Jesus highlights this. You see, they think that they have him. They think that they understand. And Jesus is going to show them how little they do understand. He's going to speak the authoritative word in verse 17. And Jesus said to them, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And they were amazed at him. Jesus could have just totally evaded the situation altogether, but he doesn't do that. And I love that about him. And then oftentimes he turns the issue back on them by asking them a question. And it's interesting because in chapter 12, when he told the parable, this is one of the few times where Jesus asks a question, verse 9, and then answers it himself. Usually he leaves them to answer the question. In other words, he engages them. And so they come asking this question. He turns around. He asks them a counter question. He draws an answer out of them, and then he takes them into lesson time. Teachable moment. Teachable moment. Let's just keep this in mind in our own life. Seize those teachable moments. Right? Whether it's with our kids or whether it's with the opposition, seek those teachable moments and take advantage of them. Oftentimes, because we live in America and everything's fast-paced. I mean, we're so fast-paced, we're constantly imbibing on the caffeine to keep us going, right? It's just go, 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 go. We're always in a rush to get somewhere to do something that's so vitally important. And oftentimes, when we are presented by God with these moments, we pass them by and don't let that happen, especially the opposition. Because we say, we can't make any inroads here. Now, there are some times, right, that we just need to walk away from that. But Jesus seizes the moment, and he's going to teach him something. But by his reply in verse 17, he acknowledges the legitimacy of human government. He doesn't rebel against that idea. This is important for us to understand. There are a lot of things that I disagree with in regards to our government and the things that they do and the way that they turn away from God and are consistently doing that. But at the same time, there is a common good that comes from it. You think about all the children that go through the secular schools, right? And I don't want to send my kids there because of all the other stuff that comes. But it does provide a sense of benefit for others in the overall community of humanity. It teaches them how to read, write, and do arithmetic, at least, yes? So we have to understand there is common good that comes from these things. God has instituted the government for that. It is a part of his common grace. Just as he sends the rain upon the wicked and the righteous alike, he provides for everybody, even those who are not a part of his holy community. They are still his creatures, and he still makes that provision for them. And the human government is a part of that. Now, yes, man can abuse it and misuse it, but we have to acknowledge the fact of its legitimacy. And it's a part of God's design, and Jesus does that. But by so saying this, Jesus also acknowledges that God's people have an obligation to the state. And he renders it an obligation. He makes sure we understand we don't have a choice in this. And one of the ways he does it is by the word he uses, render. It means to pay what is owed. I don't like to think I owe the government anything, but I owe the government. I owe the government. This implies debt. Do you understand that? This implies debt, the statement that Jesus makes. They were obligated to return to Caesar the tax that was owed him. In other words, this tax, this debt that they owed Caesar was for the use of his money and the other benefits that they partook of, being under his rule and authority, that delegated rule and authority from God. We have to be careful. And this is always a tricky thing for believers. And being a Christian and dealing with politics. Far too often I see our politics dictate way too much for the church. Our idea of leadership comes from our politic. The idea of what we think the church ought to be and function like comes from our politic. Right? As opposed to the other way around. But we have to remember, yes, we are citizens of heaven, but we are all citizens of here. Yes, whatever country we live in, and we have our obligation to those governments. And Jesus says you have a debt to Caesar and you need to pay that back to him. You owe him. And I put this in our modern, I really do, and I will just admit this fault of mine. I really try to hold the office in honor. It's a part of our system, whether it's king or president, right? It is what God has instituted in this land. And so I try to maintain respect for the presidency, but it's really hard when I don't respect the man. And I don't respect the character that is being manifested from that position, okay? And we are complex beings, so we can do both. We can hold the one in honor and respect, but we can also not respect the other. And we need to know how to distinguish and be able to handle that. But Jesus was indicating that this was not an option, that all citizens under divine obligation to pay taxes to Caesar, and so are we. It's not a choice. It's not a choice. The reply also, it's very fascinating, that as Jesus replies to these religious leaders the way that he does, he distances himself from all political anarchy. As he affirms the legitimacy of government, he turns away from all political anarchy, and it's exemplified in the zealots of his day. They were the ones who believed that it was the will of God that they fight against Rome and the Imperium and that they overthrow it, which is very fascinating. When you think, this is why it's also amazing to me, when you look at the group of men, the disciples that he chose and he appointed them to be apostles, of the 12 we have one who's a zealot, right? It's so awesome. Jesus is going to radically transform this man's life. And I guarantee you, as he's sitting there listening to this statement, this is messing up his world. Because this is completely opposed to what he thinks is the will of God. And I guarantee you, for many of us, we think we know what the will of God is, but Jesus sets us straight. This has been such an awesome journey for me going through the Gospel of Mark, and allowing Jesus to do that is to challenge my conventions and the values and things that I uphold as being all virtuous and so on. And even in my own ideal of thinking that somehow I am walking in the will of God or being a true follower of His, it's challenging me to assess and evaluate my own life and say, really am I? Really am I? So basically, Jesus refused to identify himself with all of those revolutionaries. He wasn't trying to be a rebel without a cause. He wasn't even trying to be a rebel. He was just speaking truth. And in that, he became such. And in that, he became a revolutionary. But it wasn't about just revolution for him, understand. It wasn't about the politics. His concern was ultimately the transformation of souls. So oftentimes, we as believers, we get so sidetracked with the non-essentials. We get busy discussing things that shouldn't even be discussed, and we're missing what really matters. We're so busy trying to change the world through government rather than changing the world through personal, individual, transformed lives by the power of Jesus Christ and their acceptance of Him as Savior, and they're yielding themselves to His will. Yes? For some of us in the church, we think that somehow the government is supposed to be this big totalitarian machine that is going to fulfill the Christian endeavor and the Christian mission, and it's going to fulfill the work of Christ. We fulfill the work of Christ. We are the ones who are to be out there changing lives by the truth of Jesus Christ, not being dependent on our government or our president to do that. But that doesn't mean we don't vote and we don't act as citizens and play our part and do our part and be active. But understand, we don't leave it to the government to bring about change, because the truth it won't. Not the change that is needed, yes? I mean, how much change were we promised? 8 years. It changed all right. It changed all right. But for the worse. For the worse. We are so much further from God than we were 8 years ago. Jesus placing the statement, to God, the things that are God's. Second, basically he denounces the deification of Caesar. He takes their question and he is going to elevate it beyond where they wanted it to go. He was going to take them to the greatest obligation, and that is our obligation to God. And really, the lesser, becomes subservient to the greater, and it is all enveloped in the will of God. Some believe this refers to when he talks about paying the things to God that are God's, is talking about paying to God the temple tax. But what is likely is meant is that the emperor must receive his due, but not beyond that. In other words, he was not to receive the honor and the worship that is divine, and it belongs to God and God alone. See, Jesus takes us to a whole nother dimension, yes? He's not going to dwell on the temporal and the superficial and the politic. He's going to move to the spiritual. And I pray that in the conversations that we have with people and the open doors that we are provided, and even as we face the opposition, that we will be minded to do this, to not stay on the temporal things, but take them to where it really matters. Therefore, this clearly affirms that obedience to secular power does not necessarily conflict with obligation to God. It's a part of our obligation to God. And insofar as the government does not call upon us to violate the commands and will of God, we are then to be obedient, and actively so. The lesser obligation then becomes included in the greater one, and we understand to obey God is more important than obeying man. Amazing statement by Christ. He takes this to another dimension. They come thinking they have set the perfect trap. They try to lure him in. They set the bait. They pump him up. They try to get him distracted. They give him the question thinking, we've got him on the horns of the dilemma. This is perfect. He's ensnared. We're going to take him out. And Jesus pulls the rug out from under him. He slips through the noose. He evades the trap. He evades the snare. And he puts it all back on them. And he leaves everybody astounded in the process. Few verses. Powerful truths that are laid out for us. We have clear obligations and duties as citizens, not only of the kingdom, but also of this land. And we are to render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And may we be found faithful disciples of Jesus Christ. Robert, would you close us in a word of prayer, please?